I declare myself divine.
Welcome, history enthusiasts, to a journey back in time to the heart of the mightiest empire the world has ever known. We stand at a pivotal moment in the saga of Rome. The age of Augustus, the first emperor, has passed. His long reign brought peace, the Pax Romana, and forged a sprawling empire from the chaos of civil war. He was a master statesman, a builder, a visionary who reshaped Rome in his own image, leaving behind a legacy of marble and order. Following him came Tiberius, a reluctant emperor. A seasoned general, he was grim, efficient, and deeply suspicious. His rule began with promise but descended into a dark chapter of paranoia and political purges, as he retreated from the capital to the idyllic island of Capri, governing from afar. The city of Rome, the vibrant heart of the empire, was left to fester with intrigue and fear. The Senate was cowed, the people were restless, and the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, grew ever more powerful under their ambitious prefect, Sejanus. So, as Tiberius's long and somber reign drew to a close, the Roman Empire found itself in a precarious position. It was a colossus, its legions guarding frontiers from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria. Its roads connected civilizations, its aqueducts supplied sprawling cities, and its law provided a framework for millions. It was, by all measures, the undisputed superpower of its time. But beneath this veneer of immense power, there was a palpable sense of unease. The system of one-man rule, the Principate, was still new, its rules unwritten. The transition of power was a point of extreme vulnerability. Who would follow Tiberius? Who could possibly grasp the reins of such an immense and complex entity? The empire was a giant holding its breath, waiting for a new leader to provide stability, to restore the confidence that had waned in the later years of Tiberius. The people yearned for a return to the golden days of Augustus, for an emperor who would be present, benevolent, and a symbol of hope. Into this world of immense power and quiet anxiety, a new figure emerges from the shadows of the imperial family. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, a name that echoed with Roman glory. His lineage was impeccable, a tapestry woven from the threads of Rome's most illustrious families. On his mother's side, he was the great-grandson of the divine Augustus himself, a direct link to the founder of the empire. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a woman of formidable character, revered by the Roman people as a model of virtue and courage. She was the very embodiment of traditional Roman matronly strength. On his father's side, his heritage was just as spectacular. He was the son of Germanicus Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most beloved and charismatic generals. Germanicus was the adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, and for many, he was the true heir, the man who should have succeeded Augustus. He was handsome, brave, and immensely popular with both the legions and the common folk. His campaigns in Germania were legendary, avenging the disastrous defeat at the Teutoburg Forest and restoring Roman honor. He was the people's champion, the bright hope for the future. His sudden and mysterious death in the East, under suspicious circumstances, plunged the empire into mourning and sparked whispers of foul play, whispers that often pointed towards the gloomy Tiberius. So this child, Gaius, was born into a world of privilege and peril. He was the son of a hero, the great-grandson of a god. From the moment of his birth, the weight of expectation was upon him. He was a living symbol of his family's legacy, a legacy of both glorious triumph and devastating tragedy. His very existence was a political statement. But he wasn't just known by his formal name. The name that would echo through history, the name that would become synonymous with madness and tyranny, was a simple, affectionate nickname given to him in his earliest years. As a toddler, he accompanied his father, Germanicus, on his military campaigns along the Rhine frontier. To delight the soldiers and boost their morale, his parents would often dress him in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny, hobnailed military sandals called Caligula. The legionaries, tough, battle-hardened men, were utterly charmed by this little mascot. They adored seeing the son of their beloved general toddling around the camp. Playfully, they began calling him Caligula, which in Latin means little boots. It was a term of endearment, a fond nickname for the army's darling. Little did they know that this charming moniker would one day supplant his given name, forever defining him in the annals of history. Caligula. The name started as a whisper of affection in a military camp, a symbol of hope and the continuation of a heroic line. It represented everything the Romans admired: the bond between a general and his men, the promise of a new generation, the innocence of a child born to greatness. This is the stage upon which our story begins. The Roman Empire is a magnificent, yet fragile, creation. The memory of Augustus's golden age is still fresh, but so too is the gloom of Tiberius's seclusion. The people crave a new dawn, a leader who can embody the virtues of his ancestors. And into this void steps a young man, known to the world by a childhood nickname, Little Boots. He is the son of the heroic Germanicus, the last living male of his direct line and the great-grandson of the divine Augustus. Hope surrounds him like a halo. But within the story of this hopeful beginning, there are already hints of a darker path, whispers of the tragedy to come. The shadow of his family's past, filled with untimely deaths and political intrigue, hangs over him. The very power he is destined to inherit is a force that can corrupt even the strongest of wills. What happened to this beloved little Goots to turn him into the figure history remembers? Join us as we unravel the complex and terrifying story of Caligula, from the hopeful dawn of his accession to the dark night of his infamous reign. This is the story of how a symbol of hope could become a specter of fear, and how the Roman Empire faced one of its most turbulent and shocking chapters. Thank you for watching. If you're fascinated by the dramatic history of Rome, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, so you don't miss the next chapter in the life of Rome's third emperor. Welcome back to our series on the most infamous figures in history. Today, we delve into a story that starts not with a monster, but with a little boy beloved by an entire army. This is the story of Gaius Caesar, the boy who would one day be known as Caligula. Imagine a little kid, no more than 2 or 3 years old, toddling around a hardened Roman military camp on the Rhine frontier. He's not just any kid. He's the son of Germanicus, one of Rome's most popular and brilliant generals. His mother is Agrippina the Elder, a woman of iron will and a direct descendant of the revered Augustus himself. This boy was, by all accounts, adorable. He was the army's darling, their little mascot. The soldiers, far from home and facing the harsh realities of the frontier, doted on him. They even crafted a miniature soldier's uniform for him, complete with tiny hobnailed boots called Caligulae. It was from these little boots that he earned his lifelong nickname, Caligula, meaning little boot. It was a term of endearment, a symbol of the deep affection the legions held for him and his family. For young Caligula, life was a grand adventure, surrounded by men who adored him, under the watchful eye of a heroic father and a powerful mother. He was the golden child of the Roman Empire, and his future seemed limitless. But in the treacherous world of imperial Rome, the higher you rise, the harder you can fall. The first crack in this idyllic world appeared when Caligula was just 7 years old. His father, Germanicus, was sent on a diplomatic mission to the eastern provinces. It was there, in Antioch, that the celebrated general suddenly fell ill and died. The official cause was sickness, but whispers and rumors spread like wildfire. The finger of suspicion pointed directly at the governor of Syria, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, and more chillingly, at the man who had appointed him, the Emperor Tiberius. Germanicus was Tiberius's nephew and adopted son. He was immensely popular with both the people and the army, far more popular than the aging reclusive emperor himself. Did Tiberius see his own heir as a threat? Was Germanicus's death a convenient political assassination? The Roman populace certainly thought so. When Germanicus's ashes returned to Rome, the city erupted in an unprecedented display of public grief and barely concealed anger. Young Caligula, standing beside his grieving mother, witnessed this outpouring firsthand. He learned a harsh lesson that day. Power in Rome was a dangerous game, and love from the people could be a death sentence. The death of Germanicus was not the end of the tragedy. It was only the beginning. Caligula's mother, Agrippina, was not one to suffer in silence. She openly accused Tiberius and his powerful Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, of murdering her husband. It was a bold and incredibly dangerous move. Agrippina, convinced of her family's prestige and her own righteousness, engaged in a bitter feud with the emperor. But Tiberius, paranoid and ruthless, was not a man to be challenged. One by one, Caligula's family was torn apart. His 2 older brothers, Nero and Drusus Caesar, were seen as potential rivals to the throne. On the orders of Tiberius, swayed by the machinations of Sejanus, they were arrested on trumped-up charges of treason. Nero was exiled to a desolate island and forced to commit suicide. Drusus was imprisoned in the dungeons of the Palatine Hill, where he was deliberately starved to death in the most horrific manner. Imagine Caligula, now a teenager, watching his world crumble. His heroic father was dead, his brothers were brutally executed, and his mother, the formidable Agrippina, was also arrested and exiled to a barren island where she too would die from starvation, allegedly after being flogged so severely she lost an eye. The family that had once been the toast of Rome was systematically and cruelly destroyed. Caligula was spared, but his survival came at a steep price. He was no longer the cherished little boot. He was an orphan, the last surviving male of Germanicus's direct line, living under a cloud of constant suspicion. He was a pawn in a deadly game, his life hanging by a thread, dependent on the whims of the very man he likely blamed for his family's destruction. For the next few years, Caligula lived a life of quiet terror. He was shuffled between the homes of his great-grandmother Livia and his grandmother Antonia. He learned to survive by hiding his true feelings, by masking any hint of ambition or resentment behind a facade of obedience. Every word he spoke, every glance he made was scrutinized. He had to become a master actor, playing the part of a loyal, unassuming young man while his heart must have been filled with a potent cocktail of grief, fear, and a burning desire for revenge. This was the crucible that forged the man who would become emperor. He spent his formative years surrounded by death, betrayal, and political intrigue of the most brutal kind. He learned that power was absolute, that sentiment was a weakness, and that survival often required monstrous pretense. The happy, adored child in the military camp was gone forever, replaced by a lonely, traumatized teenager haunted by the ghosts of his murdered family. Finally, in 31 AD, a major shift occurred. The powerful Sejanus, who had orchestrated so much of the family's downfall, overplayed his hand and was himself executed by Tiberius. A year later, Tiberius summoned the now 19-year-old Caligula to his infamous island retreat on Capri. For the next 6 years, Caligula would live side by side with the aging paranoid emperor. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, forced to endure the company of the man who had destroyed his entire family. What happened on that island has been the subject of lurid speculation for centuries. Ancient sources paint a picture of a den of depravity, where Caligula was forced to participate in and witness unspeakable acts. Whether these accounts are entirely true or exaggerated propaganda, one thing is certain: Caligula's time on Capri completed his dark education. He watched Tiberius rule with fear and cruelty, and he learned his lessons well. He perfected the art of sycophancy, flattering the old emperor, and hiding the deep-seated rage within. The historian Suetonius described him as the best of servants and the worst of masters. He was biding his time. This period of his life, from the adoring soldiers on the Rhine to the suffocating paranoia of Capri, is crucial to understanding the man he became. The trauma was immense, the psychological scars profound. The boy known as Little Boot was systematically stripped of everyone he loved, forced to live in constant fear, and tutored in the art of tyranny by a master. The stage was now set. When Tiberius finally died, this deeply damaged young man would be handed absolute power over the known world. What would he do with it? That is a story for our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the past. If you found this story as compelling as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. We're just getting to the beginning of Caligula's reign, and believe me, you won't want to miss it. See you next time. Imagine being a child, but instead of a playground, your world is a sun-drenched island that doubles as a gilded cage. For the young Gaius, who we know as Caligula, this was his reality. After the tragic fall of his family, the boy was summoned to the island of Capri, the secluded retreat of the aging emperor Tiberius. This wasn't an invitation for a seaside holiday. It was a summons to the very heart of power and paranoia. Capri under Tiberius was less a paradise and more a serpent's nest. The air was thick with whispers, the courtyards echoed with silent accusations, and the price of a wrong word could be a swift, brutal end. This is the environment that shaped the future emperor. Young Caligula was the last male survivor of his celebrated lineage. A living symbol of a past Tiberius both feared and resented. Every day was a test. He was surrounded by sycophants, spies, and men who would report his every move, his every sigh, back to the emperor. He witnessed firsthand the dark machinery of Tiberius's reign, the endless treason trials, the sudden disappearances, the grim executions that served as a constant, chilling reminder of his own precarious position. His relatives, his mother and brothers, had been destroyed by this very system. He was a prince held captive by suspicion. To survive, Caligula learned a skill that would define him. He became a master of disguise. He perfected the art of the impassive mask, hiding his thoughts and feelings behind a veneer of obedience and quiet deference. The historian Tacitus famously wrote that Caligula was the best of servants and the worst of masters. On Capri he was the perfect servant. He watched, he listened, and he learned to navigate the treacherous currents of court intrigue. He never betrayed his true emotions, whether it was grief for his lost family or resentment for his captor. Silence was his shield and caution was his sword. He learned to flatter the old emperor, to laugh at his cruel jokes, and to participate in the debauched lifestyle of the court, all while keeping his inner self locked away. But this constant performance came at a cost. While he was praised for his ability to endure, this period was forging deep, indelible scars on his character. He was incredibly intelligent, quick-witted, and possessed a sharp memory. He soaked up knowledge and observed the mechanics of absolute power up close. He saw how fear could be wielded as a weapon, how loyalty could be bought and sold, and how a single man's whim could decide the fate of nations. He was learning how to be an emperor, but the lessons were taught in a school of cruelty and fear. It was on this beautiful, terrifying island that the seeds of the future ruler were sown, a ruler who had learned that to survive, you must trust no one, and to rule, you must be feared by everyone. The courtiers on Capri whispered about the boy. Some saw a quiet, submissive youth merely trying to stay alive. Others saw something else in his eyes, a glint of coiled intensity, a hidden fire that his calm exterior could not entirely conceal. They saw flashes of the arrogance and cruelty that would later erupt. One courtier, a skilled reader of men, was said to have remarked that he was nursing a viper for the Roman people. Was this an exaggeration, or did they sense the darkness taking root? Was he a victim of his circumstances, warped by the trauma he endured? Or was there an inherent flaw in his character, magnified by the horrors he witnessed? These are the questions that historians still debate. Imagine the psychological pressure. He would wake up each day not knowing if it would be his last. He had to perform loyalty to the man responsible for his family's ruin. He was surrounded by luxury but starved of genuine affection or security. This intense, prolonged stress would undoubtedly affect any young mind. It's here, in the sun-bleached villas and shadowy grottos of Capri, that we find the origins of the tyrant. The mask he wore for survival may have eventually fused with his face, blurring the line between the performance and the person. The cautious boy was slowly, inexorably, being replaced by the man who would inherit the world and nearly burn it down. As Tiberius grew older and more reclusive, Caligula's position became even more critical. He was one of the few potential heirs. His every action was scrutinized not just by Tiberius, but by powerful figures at court, like the Praetorian prefect, Macro, who saw in Caligula a potential pawn for his own ambitions. Caligula had to play a multi-layered game, showing deference to Tiberius while building alliances with those who would hold power after the old emperor was gone. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering, learned in the most dangerous classroom on earth. The years on Capri were a crucible. They burned away Caligula's innocence and forged his ambition in the fires of paranoia and betrayal. He learned that power wasn't just about decrees and legions. It was about perception, manipulation, and the cold-blooded will to eliminate any and all threats. The boy who arrived on the island as a virtual prisoner was being molded into a creature of absolute power. The lessons he learned from Tiberius were not of justice or governance, but of fear, cruelty, and the intoxicating nature of unchecked authority. And then one day the news arrived. Tiberius was dead. At the age of 24, Caligula's long apprenticeship in terror was over. The mask could finally come off. He was no longer the captive prince, the quiet servant. He was the emperor of Rome. The people rejoiced, believing the son of the beloved Germanicus would usher in a new golden age. They had no idea that the man riding to Rome to claim his throne was not the hero they imagined, but a product of Capri's dark school, a man whose mind was a labyrinth of scars and secrets. The viper had been nursed, and it was now ready to strike. The stage was set for one of the most infamous and bewildering reigns in all of history. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into Caligula's formative years. The story only gets more intense from here. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for the next chapter in this incredible story. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss it. See you next time. The year is AD 37. On the sun-drenched island of Capri, an old emperor, Tiberius, finally breathes his last. His reign, which began with promise, had descended into a dark winter of paranoia and terror. From his secluded villa, he had ruled Rome with an iron fist, his network of spies and informers turning neighbor against neighbor. The air in the capital was thick with fear, the Senate was cowed, and the people lived under a constant shadow of suspicion. The death of Tiberius was not just the end of a man. It was the end of an era, a long, suffocating nightmare from which Rome was desperate to awaken. As the news of his death spread, a wave of relief, almost euphoric, washed over the city. Doors were thrown open and people poured into the streets, not in mourning, but in celebration. The collective sigh of relief was audible. They were free. But this newfound freedom brought with it a pressing question. Who would now wear the purple? The Roman Empire, a sprawling behemoth of power and territory, held its breath. The future was a blank page, and the name to be written upon it would shape the destiny of millions. In the complex web of Roman succession, there were several potential players. But one name, one young man, stood out from the rest. He was the son of the beloved hero Germanicus, a military legend whose memory was still cherished by the legions and the people alike. This young man was Gaius, but history would know him by a different name. A childhood nickname given to him by his father's soldiers, Caligula, meaning little boot. At just 24 years old, he was about to step from the shadows of imperial intrigue onto the very center of the world stage. How did a 24-year-old with relatively little political experience secure the most powerful position on earth? The answer lies in a perfect storm of popular support, military backing, and political maneuvering. The key player in Caligula's ascension was Naevius Sutorius Macro, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Macro was an ambitious and ruthless operator. Sensing the shifting political winds as Tiberius's health failed, he had carefully aligned himself with the young Caligula. It was Macro who controlled the elite soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards and the only military force stationed in Rome. Their loyalty was paramount, and Macro ensured it belonged to Caligula. When Tiberius died, Macro acted swiftly and decisively. He presented Caligula to the Praetorian Guard, hailing him as the new emperor. With the backing of the most formidable military unit in the capital, Caligula's claim was virtually unassailable. The soldiers, many of whom had served under his father Germanicus, cheered for the son of their hero. Their acclamation was a powerful statement, a de facto coronation that the political establishment could not ignore. The Senate, which had lived in terror of Tiberius, was more than willing to ratify the Praetorians' choice. They saw in Caligula not a threat but a chance for a new beginning. Tiberius had left a co-heir in his will, his own grandson, Gemellus. But Gemellus was a boy, and the Senate, with Macro's encouragement, quickly nullified the will, declaring Caligula the sole emperor. They showered him with titles and honors, hoping to curry favor with the new ruler and restore the Senate's own diminished prestige. They were banking on the idea that the son of the noble Germanicus would be everything Tiberius was not: generous, respectful, and cooperative. But it wasn't just the soldiers and senators. The people of Rome were utterly captivated. Caligula was young, charismatic, and handsome. He was the living embodiment of a brighter future. When he made his formal entry into Rome, the city erupted in a frenzy of celebration that lasted for days. The historian Suetonius tells us that the crowds were so thick it took Caligula hours to travel from the city gates to the palace. People from all walks of life, plebeians, equestrians, and senators lined the streets, shouting his name, throwing flowers, and hailing him as their star and their savior. In the first few months, Caligula did everything to live up to these impossibly high expectations. His initial acts were a masterclass in public relations. He granted a general amnesty, releasing those imprisoned by Tiberius on treason charges and burning the records of their trials in a grand public spectacle in the Forum. He paid out the generous legacies left in Tiberius's will, and then added a substantial bonus from his own funds to the Praetorian Guard and the citizens of Rome. He abolished unpopular taxes and recalled exiles. He sponsored lavish gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances, keeping the populace entertained and happy. He treated the Senate with a level of respect they hadn't seen in decades. He would stand in the presence of the consuls, address the senators courteously, and promise a partnership in governance. To the world, it seemed that the Golden Age had returned. Here was an emperor who was not a paranoid recluse like Tiberius, but a vibrant, engaging leader who loved his people. The joy was palpable. Rome believed it had found its champion, a benevolent ruler who would heal the wounds of the past and lead them into a glorious new era. The son of Germanicus had come home, and the entire Roman world lay at his feet, filled with hope and adoration. They could not possibly have known the darkness that was to follow. The terrifying transformation that would turn their beloved little boot into one of history's most infamous tyrants. The road to power had been swift and triumphant. The road ahead, however, would be paved with madness and blood. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into Roman history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our journey through the lives of the Caesars. Today, we arrive at a moment filled with dazzling hope and boundless optimism. The dawn of Caligula's reign. This is Chapter 5, The Golden Beginning. Imagine Rome in 37 AD. The city, weary from the dark and paranoid final years of Tiberius, suddenly awakens to a new era. A young charismatic emperor, Gaius, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, has ascended to the throne. The air itself seems to crackle with excitement and relief. This wasn't just a change of ruler. It felt like the sunrise after a long, oppressive night. The initial reports coming from the Palatine Hill were almost too good to be true. Caligula, the son of the beloved hero Germanicus, seemed to be everything the Roman people had ever dreamed of in a leader. He was handsome, energetic, and most importantly, he seemed to have a genuine affection for his people. The Senate, the army, and the common citizens were united in their adoration for this new emperor. The transition of power was smooth, celebratory, and hailed as a divine blessing. One of Caligula's very first acts was a masterstroke of public relations and genuine compassion. He declared a general amnesty, opening the prison doors for those who had been incarcerated on political charges during Tiberius's reign. Men who had languished in dungeons, fearing for their lives under the dreaded treason laws, suddenly found themselves free, their families restored, their property returned. This single act sent a powerful message across the empire. The era of fear was over. The notorious treason trials, which had become a tool for paranoia and political revenge, were officially abolished. Caligula even made a grand public spectacle of burning the records of these trials in the Forum, symbolically purging the state of its recent, dark past. He proclaimed that he had nothing to fear, and therefore no one else should either. His generosity didn't stop there. Caligula understood the importance of the military, especially the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. To secure their loyalty and reward their support, he paid out the bonuses promised to them in his mother Agrippina's will and then doubled them from his own funds. This wasn't just a political calculation. It was a grand gesture that won him the unwavering devotion of the most powerful military unit in Rome. Soldiers who had once served a reclusive and suspicious emperor now served a young, open-handed leader who treated them with respect and generosity. But Caligula knew that to truly win the heart of Rome, he had to win the hearts of its people. And he did so with a flair for the spectacular that the city hadn't seen in decades. He launched a breathtaking series of public games, festivals, and theatrical performances. The Circus Maximus thundered with the sound of chariot races day after day. The arenas were filled with exotic animal hunts and gladiatorial contests of unprecedented scale. He sponsored plays, musical contests, and public banquets, sparing no expense to entertain the populace. These weren't just distractions. They were a celebration of a new age. Caligula himself was often seen among the crowds, sharing in their joy, his presence adding to the festive atmosphere. He restored traditions that had lapsed and introduced new holidays, making it seem as if life in Rome was one continuous festival. The people were ecstatic. Their new emperor was not a distant, godlike figure hiding on an island. He was one of them, a leader who understood their desire for joy and spectacle. They showered him with titles, including Pater Patrii, or father of the fatherland, an honor he humbly and strategically accepted. In those first few months, the promise was immense. The economy was stimulated by his lavish spending. Political life was revitalized by the end of the treason trials, and public morale was higher than it had been in a generation. Poets and historians of the time wrote of a new Saturnia Regna, a return to the mythical golden age of Saturn, a time of peace, prosperity, and happiness. It seemed as if the dream was finally becoming a reality under the rule of the young and benevolent Caligula. The shadows of the past were banished, and the future of Rome looked brighter and more golden than ever before. This was the emperor everyone had been waiting for. This idyllic beginning, this period of universal acclaim and boundless promise, is what makes the subsequent chapters of Caligula's life so profoundly shocking and tragic. The man who began as a beacon of hope would soon become a symbol of something far, far darker. But for now, in the glorious dawn of his power, Rome was in love with its emperor, and the golden age seemed to have truly begun. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of Caligula is one of the most dramatic in all of history, and we're just getting started. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next episode as we explore the moment everything began to change. Welcome back to our series on the Roman emperors. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6 of Caligula's story, a chapter that marks a dramatic and terrifying turning point. Sudden illness. Sudden change. Picture this. Rome, 37 AD, the city is buzzing with optimism. Their new emperor, the young and beloved Caligula, has spent his first few months winning hearts and minds. He's been generous, just, and everything the people hoped for. The sun is shining on the Roman Empire. But then, just 7 months into his reign, a dark cloud descends. Caligula falls gravely, mysteriously ill. The news spreads like wildfire through the streets of Rome and across the provinces. The vibrant, energetic leader is suddenly confined to his sickbed, fighting for his life. Imagine the collective panic. The Roman people had pinned all their hopes on this young man, the son of the revered Germanicus. They had seen him as a new beginning, a break from the gloomy final years of Tiberius. Now it looked as though their dream was about to be snatched away. The entire empire holds its breath. From the grandest temples in Rome to the smallest household shrines in distant lands, prayers and sacrifices are offered for his recovery. People gather in public squares, their faces etched with worry, sharing whispers and rumors about the emperor's condition. They fear not just for the man but for the stability of the empire. What would happen if he died? Would there be another power struggle? Would the Praetorian Guard install another emperor? The uncertainty was terrifying. The outpouring of public grief and concern was immense, a genuine testament to how much he was loved in those early days. They weren't just praying for an emperor. They were praying for their hero, their beacon of hope. Then, a collective sigh of relief. The news arrives. Caligula has recovered. The fever has broken, and he is alive. The city erupts in celebration. The festivals and games thrown to mark his recovery are said to have been even grander than those celebrating his accession. The nightmare was over. Or so they thought, because the man who emerged from that sick room was not the same man who had entered it. Something had irrevocably changed. The affable, charming, and just ruler was gone. In his place stood a figure who was paranoid, cruel, and increasingly erratic. The transformation was as swift as it was shocking. The clemency and generosity that defined his early reign evaporated, replaced by a chilling new reality of executions, confiscations, and bizarre proclamations. He began to see conspiracies everywhere, turning on his closest friends and family members, including those who had nursed him back to health. The Senate, which he had once treated with respect, was now the target of his scorn and humiliation. This is the great mystery of Caligula's reign, a question that has fascinated historians for 2 millennia. What happened during that illness? What could possibly explain such a profound and destructive personality shift? There are several compelling theories, and the truth is likely a complex mix of them all. The most common explanation at the time, and one that persists today, is that he suffered from some form of brain fever. This is an archaic term, but it could point to a number of real medical conditions. Perhaps it was encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain, or meningitis. High fevers associated with such illnesses can cause neurological damage, leading to lasting changes in personality, impulse control, and rational thought. It's a medically plausible theory. A physical ailment could have literally rewired his brain, transforming the beloved prince into the monster of legend. Another theory, one whispered in the corridors of the palace, was poison. In the high-stakes world of Roman imperial politics, poisoning was a constant threat. Is it possible that an enemy attempted to assassinate Caligula with a slow-acting poison? Perhaps the poison didn't kill him, but instead left him with permanent brain damage, triggering the paranoia and madness that would follow. This theory adds a layer of political intrigue to the medical mystery. Who would have done it? A rival for the throne? A holdover from Tiberius's court? We'll likely never know for sure, but it remains a tantalizing possibility. But there is a third, more psychological explanation, and it might be the most chilling of all. What if the illness didn't change him? What if it simply unveiled him? Think about his upbringing. Caligula had witnessed unspeakable trauma as a child. He saw his mother and brothers arrested and starved to death on the orders of Emperor Tiberius. He then spent his teenage years living on the island of Capri, a virtual prisoner under the watchful, paranoid eye of the very man who destroyed his family. He learned to survive by suppressing his true feelings, by wearing a mask of obedience and cheerfulness. Perhaps that illness, a brush with his own mortality, shattered the mask he had worn for so long. The experience of being so close to death, combined with the absolute power he now wielded, may have unleashed the darkness that had been festering inside him since childhood. The paranoia wasn't new. It was a survival mechanism he'd learned on Capri. The cruelty wasn't a symptom of fever. It was a rage he had been forced to suppress for years. In this view, the good Caligula of the first 7 months was the act. The mad Caligula that emerged was his true self, finally free from all restraint. So was it a damaged brain, a dose of poison, or a broken mind? Was Caligula a victim of a tragic illness, or was he a monster all along, simply waiting for the right moment to reveal himself? This debate lies at the heart of his story. The illness of 37 AD is the pivot point on which his entire legacy turns. Before it, a golden age seemed to be dawning. After it, a reign of terror began that would cement his name in history as a synonym for tyranny and insanity. The bright hope of Rome had been extinguished, replaced by a terrifying and unpredictable darkness that would grip the empire for the next 4 years. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into a crucial moment in Roman history. It's a fascinating and tragic story, and there's still so much more to uncover about Caligula's reign. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue the journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. We love having you here. See you next time. Welcome back to our series. Today, we delve into the darkest chapter of Emperor Caligula's reign, a period that saw a young, promising ruler descend into a maelstrom of paranoia and unimaginable cruelty. This is Chapter 7, The Descent. When we left off, Caligula had survived a severe illness, but something within him had irrevocably broken. The man who emerged was not the same one Rome had celebrated. He was haunted by shadows, seeing traitors in every corner, and his fear began to curdle into a terrifying form of sadism. It started subtly with suspicious glances and hushed accusations. But soon, the whispers turned into warrants, and the warrants into death sentences. The Senate, once a body of respected advisors, became his personal hunting ground. Senators who had served Rome for decades found themselves accused of treason on the flimsiest of pretexts. Imagine the terror that gripped the city's elite. One day you are a respected statesman, the next you are dragged from your home, your family watching in horror. Your fate sealed by the whim of a single man. The trials were a farce. Evidence was fabricated, witnesses coerced, and the verdicts were always guilty. Executions became a public spectacle, a brutal warning to anyone who might dare to even think of dissent. But Caligula's paranoia was not confined to the political sphere. It bled into his personal life, poisoning his closest relationships. Friends he had grown up with, men who had shared his laughter and his secrets, were suddenly viewed with suspicion. A misplaced word, a look that lingered a second too long, was enough to sign their death warrant. He turned on them with a chilling swiftness, erasing years of loyalty in a single brutal command. The bonds of friendship, family, and trust meant nothing anymore. All that mattered was Caligula's absolute, unquestioned power. Among the most heart-wrenching casualties of this purge were members of his own family. His cousin, Gemellus, who had once been named co-heir, was one of the first to fall. Caligula accused him of plotting against him, a baseless charge, and forced him to take his own life. This was a young man whose only crime was being born into the same family. Then came the turn of his own father-in-law, Marcus Junius Silanus. Silanus was a respected and honorable man, but his influence and integrity were seen as a threat. Caligula humiliated him publicly before compelling him to meet a similar, tragic end. These acts were not just political maneuvering. They were the cold-blooded elimination of anyone who could represent an alternative, anyone who reminded him of a time before he became this monster. As the body count rose, something else was growing within Caligula, a belief in his own divinity. It was no longer enough to be an emperor, a first citizen. He began to see himself as a living god. He demanded that temples be built in his honor, and that his statues be placed alongside those of the traditional Roman deities like Jupiter. He would appear in public dressed as various gods and goddesses, Hercules, Venus, Apollo, expecting and demanding to be worshipped. He would engage in conversations with a statue of Jupiter, sometimes arguing with it, sometimes whispering secrets to it, as if it were his equal. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a complete detachment from reality. For the deeply religious people of Rome, this was the ultimate blasphemy. An emperor was the high priest of the state, the Pontifex Maximus, but he was still a man, a servant of the gods. By declaring himself a god, Caligula was shattering the very foundation of Roman religious and social order. He even planned to have a colossal statue of himself erected in the sacred temple in Jerusalem, an act of provocation that nearly sparked a massive rebellion in the eastern provinces. Only the frantic efforts of his advisors prevented a full-blown war. His divine delusions also fueled his cruelty. If he was a god, then mortal lives were insignificant. He famously lamented that the Roman people did not have a single neck so he could sever it with one blow. He took a sadistic pleasure in the suffering of others. At the gladiatorial games, he would sometimes order the awnings that protected the crowd from the scorching sun to be pulled back, and forbid anyone from leaving, forcing them to bake in the heat. He forced fathers to watch the executions of their own sons, reportedly watching their faces for any sign of grief, which he would punish with death. He would dine with the executioner as his guest of honor, casually signing death warrants between courses. The palace, once a center of governance, became a theater of horror. His cruelty was inventive, almost artistic in its depravity. He saw no difference between the lives of men and the lives of animals, and he treated both with the same casual, terrifying disregard. Rome was no longer a republic or an empire. It was Caligula's personal playground, and its citizens were his toys to be broken at will. This reign of terror could not last. Every execution, every act of divine arrogance, every moment of sadistic pleasure was chipping away at the foundations of his power. The fear he inspired was immense, but fear eventually gives way to desperation. The very people tasked with protecting him, the Praetorian Guard, began to realize that no one was safe. Their loyalty was to Rome and to their own survival, not to a madman on the throne. A conspiracy began to form, not among senators in their villas, but in the barracks of the men who guarded the emperor's life. They knew that to save Rome, and to save themselves, Caligula had to be stopped. The stage was being set for one final bloody act. Join us next time for the conclusion of our story as we witness the assassination of Caligula and the chaotic aftermath that would forever change the Roman Empire. The descent is complete, but the consequences are just beginning to unfold. Thank you for watching. If you're finding this series insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring these stories to life. We'll see you in the final chapter. Welcome back to our series on the Roman emperors. Today, we delve into Chapter 8, The Divine Emperor, a chapter that marks a chilling turning point in the reign of Caligula. This is where his eccentricities transform into full-blown megalomania, a descent into madness that would leave Rome reeling. Imagine the scene: Rome, the heart of a vast empire, built on tradition, law, and a complex pantheon of gods. Now, imagine its leader, a young man named Gaius, better known as Caligula, standing before the Senate, before the people, and declaring something utterly unprecedented. He wasn't just a representative of the gods, or even a descendant. He declared himself a living god, right here on earth. This wasn't just a passing fancy or a poetic metaphor. Caligula meant it, and he enforced it with the full weight of his imperial power. The emperor, who had once been seen as the first citizen, was now demanding to be worshipped as Jupiter Lateris. the supreme deity of the Roman state. He wasn't just claiming divinity. He was claiming the highest divinity. To solidify this new status, Caligula embarked on a massive empire-wide construction project. He ordered temples to be erected in his own honor, not just in far-flung provinces but in Rome itself. The historic temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum, a sacred site for centuries, was annexed and converted into a mere entrance hall for his own palace. He wanted the people of Rome to literally walk through a temple to reach him, reinforcing the idea that approaching the emperor was like approaching a god. Altars were built where sacrifices were to be made not to the gods for the emperor's well-being, but directly to Caligula himself. Priests were appointed, forming a new college dedicated solely to his cult. And who was the head priest of this new religion? None other than Caligula himself, serving as the high priest to his own divinity. He even appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a priest in his cult, a move so absurd it highlights the depth of his contempt for Roman tradition. Statues were another key part of this campaign. Caligula ordered countless statues of himself to be carved and placed in sacred spaces across the empire. But these weren't ordinary imperial portraits. He often had the heads of famous statues of gods, like Jupiter and Apollo, removed and replaced with his own likeness. He was, in effect, hijacking the established religious imagery of Rome and rebranding it as his own. He wanted every citizen, in every corner of the empire, to see his face when they looked to the heavens for guidance. This demand for worship created enormous tension throughout the empire, but nowhere was the conflict more acute than in the province of Judea. The Jewish people, with their strict monotheistic faith, could not and would not worship a mortal man as a god. It was a direct violation of their most sacred commandments. For centuries, Rome had generally respected this, granting them certain exemptions from the imperial cult. Caligula, however, saw this resistance not as a matter of religious conviction, but as personal defiance. His vanity could not tolerate a single group of subjects, refusing to acknowledge his godhood. He became fixated on this problem. In a move that sent shockwaves through the eastern Mediterranean, he ordered a colossal, gilded statue of himself to be erected directly inside the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred site in Judaism. This was an act of sacrilege on an unimaginable scale. Petronius, the governor of Syria, was tasked with carrying out the order. He knew it would trigger a massive, bloody revolt. The Jewish population pleaded with him, protesting peacefully but resolutely, telling him they would rather die than see their temple desecrated. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who led a delegation to Caligula to plead their case, described the emperor's terrifying and erratic behavior. He mocked their beliefs, asked them absurd questions like, "Why do you refuse to eat pork?" and dismissed their deeply held faith as stubbornness. Petronius, caught between an insane emperor and a population on the brink of rebellion, risked his own life by delaying the order. He wrote to Caligula, explaining the practical difficulties and the certainty of war. For this act of reason, Caligula ordered his execution. It was only by a stroke of luck the ship carrying the execution order was delayed by storms. While the ship carrying news of Caligula's own assassination arrived first, that Petronius survived. This episode reveals the terrifying fusion of Caligula's vanity and his cruelty. His need for adoration was absolute, and any perceived slight, any refusal to participate in his grand delusion, was met with disproportionate rage. He wasn't just a tyrant demanding political loyalty. He was a self-proclaimed god demanding spiritual submission. He would appear in public dressed as various gods and goddesses, one day as Hercules with a club and lion skin, the next as Venus, adorned in fine silks. He engaged in conversations with a statue of Jupiter, sometimes whispering, sometimes shouting at it as if arguing with a rival. He even built a bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, so he could, as he claimed, visit his fellow god more easily. This wasn't just a performance for the public. It seems Caligula truly believed in his own divine nature. His cruelty took on a new, almost theological dimension. Insulting Caligula was no longer just treason. It was blasphemy. And the punishment for blasphemy, in his eyes, knew no bounds. He blurred the line between the sacred and the profane, between emperor and deity, until there was no line left at all. His reign became a horrifying spectacle where the emperor's personal vanity dictated the spiritual life of an entire empire, and his cruelty was the divine retribution for anyone who dared to disagree. This deification was the ultimate expression of his power. He had mastered the political world, and now he sought to master the spiritual one. But in doing so, he alienated everyone, from the common citizen to the Roman elite, and most dangerously, the Praetorian Guard. His divine pretensions were not just an insult to the gods but a constant, terrifying reminder to the people of Rome that their emperor was bound by no law, no tradition, and no sanity. The living God was proving to be a mortal danger, and his end was drawing near. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story of Caligula is a stark reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter, where this divine madness finally meets its violent end. See you next time.
Welcome back to our series, where we delve into the lives of history's most fascinating figures. Today, we enter Chapter 9. Extravagance and madness. This is where the story takes a turn. From a ruler with absolute power to a man seemingly determined to bankrupt an entire empire for his own amusement. Imagine a world where the treasury isn't just a national resource, but a personal piggy bank, and the goal is to empty it in the most spectacular way possible. This was the reality under our subject's reign, a period marked by such opulence that it bordered on the absurd. So, how does one even begin to spend an empire's fortune? For him, it started with games, but we're not talking about simple athletic contests. These were spectacles of an unprecedented scale, designed to shock, and distract. The grand arenas, once stages for martial prowess, were transformed into fantastical landscapes. Entire forests were transplanted into the Colosseum for staged hunts featuring exotic animals from the farthest corners of the empire. Naval battles, known as naumachia, were recreated in specially flooded amphitheaters, with thousands of combatants fighting to the death for the crowd's entertainment. These weren't just events. They were month-long festivals of excess. The cost was astronomical, not just in gold, but in lives and resources, all to satisfy one man's craving for a show. The public was given bread and circuses, but the circuses were draining the lifeblood of Rome. And when the games concluded, the feasting began. His banquets were legendary, not for their culinary excellence, but for their sheer, jaw-dropping wastefulness. These were not mere dinners. They were theatrical productions of gluttony. We had tales of dishes made from the tongues of nightingales, the brains of peacocks, and the livers of rare fish, all served on solid gold plates. But the most infamous story, the one that perfectly captures his mindset, is the tale of the pearl. It's said that during one lavish banquet, he made a bet that he could host the most expensive dinner in history. To win, he took a pearl of immense value, a treasure worth a fortune, dropped it into a goblet of strong vinegar, and once it dissolved, he drank it. It wasn't about taste or enjoyment. It was a pure, unadulterated display of power. It was his way of saying, I can destroy more wealth in a single gulp than most of you will see in a lifetime. This act wasn't just extravagant. It was a declaration of his contempt for value, for tradition, and for the very concept of fiscal responsibility. His spending wasn't confined to fleeting events. He wanted to build a legacy of luxury, to carve his opulence into the very landscape. This led to a construction frenzy that defied all logic and reason. He commissioned the building of enormous pleasure palaces, filled with gilded walls, ivory-inlaid furniture, and intricate mosaics. One of his most ambitious projects was a revolving dining room, an engineering marvel designed to rotate day and night, mimicking the heavens. His gardens were equally fantastical, filled with exotic plants and animals, intricate fountains, and man-made lakes. Perhaps the most notorious of his architectural follies were his pleasure ships. These were not boats, they were floating palaces. 2 such ships were built on Lake Nemi, vast structures equipped with marble floors, heating systems, and lavish decorations. They were temples to leisure, complete with baths, colonnades, and banquet halls, all afloat on a serene lake. They served no military or practical purpose. They were simply there for his entertainment. Enormous, gilded symbols of a treasury being sunk, literally and figuratively. These projects employed thousands, yes, but they were a constant drain on the state's coffers. Quarries were emptied, forests were felled, and artisans were pulled from essential public works, all to construct monuments to one man's ego. The cost was staggering, diverting funds that were desperately needed for infrastructure, for the legions, and for the welfare of the Roman people. As the gold flowed from the treasury into these lavish projects, the empire began to feel the strain. The story of our ruler's extravagance isn't just about wild parties and fancy buildings. It's about the very real consequences of unchecked spending. To fund his lifestyle, taxes were raised to unbearable levels, not just on the wealthy, but on every citizen. New, creative, and often cruel taxes were invented, levied on everything from lawsuits to funerals. The provinces, the backbone of the empire's economy, were squeezed dry. Governors were instructed to send more and more tribute, not for the good of Rome, but for the emperor's personal slush fund. The economic fallout was severe. The currency was devalued as he ordered coins to be minted with less precious metal, a desperate attempt to stretch his remaining resources. This led to rampant inflation, making life increasingly difficult for the common person. The grain supply, which the city of Rome depended on for survival, was often mismanaged or diverted to feed the exotic animals for his games. While the emperor feasted on peacock brains, the people worried about where their next loaf of bread would come from. A quiet resentment began to simmer throughout the empire. The legions on the frontiers went unpaid. The roads fell into disrepair, and the grand machinery of the Roman state began to groan under the impossible weight of one man's. The extravagance was no longer just a spectacle. It was a crisis, a creeping madness that was eroding the very foundations of the world's greatest empire. The madness of the man in charge was becoming the madness of an entire system pushed to its breaking point. His pursuit of personal pleasure was leading Rome down a path of economic ruin and political instability, setting the stage for the dramatic and violent events that would follow. This chapter of our story serves as a stark reminder of how quickly unchecked power and personal indulgence can threaten even the most powerful of empires. The line between a strong leader and a destructive tyrant can be blurred by the seductive allure of infinite resources. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of extravagance and madness. If you found this fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history's most compelling stories. We'll see you in the next chapter.
Welcome back to our series on the Roman emperors. Today we're diving into Chapter 10, Strange Projects, and we're focusing on one of history's most notorious figures, Caligula. His reign is a goldmine of bizarre tales, and we're about to explore some of the most outlandish. Was he a madman, a political satirist, or something else entirely? Let's find out. Picture this. The Roman Senate, filled with the most powerful men in the empire, is told that a new consul might soon be joining their ranks. Nothing unusual there, right? Except the candidate is a horse. Yes, you heard me correctly. Caligula's beloved horse, Incitatus, was at the center of one of history's most famous stories. Incitatus was no ordinary horse. He lived a life of unimaginable luxury. He had a stable made of marble, a manger of ivory, and wore a collar studded with precious jewels. He was fed oats mixed with gold flakes and was served by a dedicated team of slaves. It's said Caligula would even invite the horse to dine with him at lavish banquets, treating him as an honored guest. But the story goes even further. The ancient historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio both report that Caligula planned to elevate Incitatus to the position of consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. Imagine a horse, draped in a purple-bordered toga, holding a position once held by giants like Cicero and Julius Caesar. So the billion-dollar question is, was Caligula serious? Or was this all a massive, elaborate prank? Let's unpack the possibilities. One popular theory is that this was a calculated act of political satire. The Roman Senate, once a powerful governing body, had become largely ceremonial under the emperors. The senators were often sycophantic, rubber-stamping the emperor's decisions without question. By suggesting his horse could do their job, was Caligula making a biting commentary on their irrelevance? Was he saying, "You're all so useless, my horse could do a better job than any of you"? It was a supreme act of mockery, designed to humiliate the Senate and showcase his absolute, untouchable power. Another interpretation is that it was simply a sign of his deteriorating mental state. Caligula's reign is filled with stories of cruelty, paranoia, and egomania. Perhaps making his horse a consul wasn't a political statement, but the genuine delusion of a man who had lost his grip on reality. A man who believed his power was so divine that he could bend the rules of society and even nature to his will. Or maybe it was a bit of both. A cruel joke born from a mind unraveling under the weight of absolute power. The truth is, we'll never know for sure. The plan never came to fruition because Caligula was assassinated before he could follow through. But the story of Incitatus, the consul-to-be, has echoed through the centuries, a perfect symbol of Caligula's strange and unsettling reign. It is a testament to how power can corrupt and how reality can become stranger than any fiction. But making his horse a politician wasn't Caligula's only bizarre project. Let's talk about his incredible and incredibly pointless bridge of boats. The story begins with a prophecy. An astrologer named Thrasyllus had once told Caligula's predecessor Tiberius that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baia. This bay near modern-day Naples was a wide, 3-mile stretch of water. It was a popular resort area for the Roman elite, known for its beautiful villas and calm seas. For most people, a prophecy like that would be a metaphor, but not for Caligula. Once he became emperor, he seemed obsessed with defying it, literally. He decided he wouldn't just ride a horse across the bay, he would build a bridge to do it. This wasn't just any bridge. Caligula ordered the confiscation of nearly every merchant ship he could find from all over the empire. This caused a massive disruption in trade and led to food shortages, particularly in Rome, as grain ships were commandeered for his vanity project. These ships were then anchored side by side in 2 rows, stretching over 3 miles from Baia to the neighboring port of Puteoli. Planks were laid over the decks, and the entire surface was covered with earth to create a solid roadway, mimicking the famous Appian Way. The project was a monumental undertaking, consuming vast resources and manpower. And for what? So that Caligula could stage a 2-day spectacle. On the first day, he rode back and forth across his new bridge. He was adorned in the armor of Alexander the Great, complete with a golden cloak, a sword and a shield, riding his beloved horse Incitatus. He was followed by a procession of his Praetorian Guard and friends, a triumphant parade across the sea. The second day was even more extravagant. Caligula, now dressed as a charioteer, rode in a chariot pulled by 2 famous racehorses, leading another grand procession. He then hosted a massive party on the bridge itself. There were banquet tables, flowing wine, and entertainment. As the night wore on, the celebration devolved into a chaotic, drunken revel. According to historians, a heavily intoxicated Caligula ordered many of the spectators to be thrown into the sea below. Some were rescued by boatmen, but many others drowned in the chaos. So, what was the point of all this? Was it just to prove a prophecy wrong, or was there a deeper meaning? Some historians believe it was a demonstration of power, showing that Caligula could conquer even the sea, a domain of the god Neptune. By building this bridge, he was elevating himself to the level of the gods, a common theme in his reign. He wanted to show the world, and especially his rivals in the Senate, that nothing was impossible for him. He could defy prophecies, nature, and logic itself. Whatever the reason, the Bridge of Boats was a perfect example of Caligula's leadership style, theatrical, wasteful, and ultimately pointless. Once the 2-day party was over, the incredibly expensive bridge was dismantled, and the ships were returned to their owners. The grain shortages in Rome grew worse, and the treasury was significantly lighter, all for a fleeting moment of imperial ego. Caligula's strange projects weren't limited to his horse or his floating bridge. He was also an ambitious, if not particularly practical builder. While emperors like Augustus were known for transforming Rome with magnificent and lasting structures, Caligula's architectural legacy is a mix of the bizarre, the incomplete, and the incredibly expensive. One of his most ambitious projects was an attempt to cut a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth in Greece. This was a project that had been dreamed of for centuries, even by Julius Caesar. It would have been a major engineering feat, connecting the Ionian and Aegean seas and dramatically shortening trade routes. Caligula sent surveyors and began the work, but like many of his plans, it was abandoned after his assassination. The canal was eventually completed, but not until the 19th century. Back in Rome, his building projects were often centered around his own divine image. He extended the imperial palace onto the Palatine Hill, and then he decided to connect it directly to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. He essentially built a bridge or extension that allowed him to walk from his house directly into the most sacred temple in Rome, symbolizing his claim to divinity. He would supposedly hold conversations with the statue of Jupiter, sometimes arguing with the god, sometimes whispering secrets. He also began construction on 2 new aqueducts for Rome, the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus. To be fair, these were genuinely useful and necessary projects, as Rome's population was growing. However, they were so massively expensive that they drained the state treasury. While Caligula started them, it was his successor, Claudius, who would complete them and get most of the credit. Another strange endeavor was his construction of 2 enormous, lavishly decorated ships, known as the Nemiships. These weren't warships or merchant vessels. They were essentially floating palaces, built to be moored on the small, sacred Lake Nemi, not far from Rome. They were incredibly luxurious, featuring marble floors, heating systems, plumbing, and exquisite decorations. One was likely a temple dedicated to the goddess Diana, while the other was a floating party palace for the emperor. They were technological marvels for their time but served no practical purpose other than as a testament to Caligula's extravagance. For centuries, they lay at the bottom of the lake, until they were finally recovered in the 20th century, only to be tragically destroyed during World War II. From making his horse a consul, to building a bridge across the sea, to constructing floating palaces on a tiny lake, Caligula's projects were a reflection of his personality, grand, unpredictable, and often teetering on the edge of madness. They drained the Roman treasury and often served no purpose beyond inflating his own ego. Whether these were the actions of a calculated tyrant or a delusional madman, they have left us with some of the most fascinating and bizarre stories from the ancient world. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Caligula's strange projects. What do you think? Was he mad or a master of political theater? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the annals of history, where today we delve into a chapter that is as chilling as it is compelling. The reign of Caligula and his brand of cruel entertainment. Forget what you think you know about Roman spectacles. Caligula took public amusement to a dark and terrifying new level. His rule wasn't just about power. It was about performance, a theatrical display of absolute authority where the lines between emperor and monster blurred, and the Roman people were his captive audience. Imagine the Grand Colosseum, not filled with the usual gladiatorial contests, but with a sense of dread. Caligula didn't just want to entertain his people. He wanted to shock them, to horrify them. This wasn't about the thrill of the fight. It was about the raw, unfiltered display of his power over life and death. He found a twisted delight in turning the arena into his personal playground of cruelty, a stage for his most depraved impulses. The roar of the crowd was often replaced by a stunned, fearful silence. One of the most infamous accounts of his reign tells of a time when, due to a shortage of condemned criminals to feed to the wild beasts in the arena, Caligula ordered a section of the crowd to be seized and thrown to the animals instead. Picture the scene. Families enjoying a day at the games, suddenly finding themselves part of the gruesome spectacle. He allegedly had their tongues cut out first, to prevent them from screaming curses at him. This wasn't justice or punishment. It was chaos unleashed, a terrifying message that no one, absolutely no one, was safe from his whims. This love for the macabre extended to official executions. While public executions were a part of Roman life, Caligula took a personal and grotesque pleasure in them. He would often dine near the site of the execution, savoring his meal while watching men die. He insisted on the deaths being slow and drawn out, ordering the executioners to use small, repeated blows, instructing them to strike so that he may feel that he is dying. For Caligula, the suffering was the point. It was the ultimate demonstration of his dominion over another human being's existence, and he watched it with a reported sense of delight and fascination. But his cruelty wasn't confined to the arena or the executioner's block. It was a tool he used to assert his dominance over the Roman elite, the very senators and nobles who were meant to be his peers. He reveled in their humiliation. One of his favorite pastimes was forcing high-ranking senators and distinguished noblemen dressed in their finest togas to run for miles alongside his chariot like common servants. Can you imagine the sheer degradation? These were proud, powerful men, reduced to panting, sweating figures of ridicule, all for the emperor's amusement. This wasn't just physical exertion. It was a profound psychological attack, stripping them of their dignity in the most public way imaginable. On other occasions, he would invite senators to lavish banquets, only to disappear with one of their wives and then return to the table, brazenly discussing her performance in bed in front of her husband and the other guests. He would make them bid against each other for gladiators or other trivial items at absurdly inflated prices, bankrupting them for his own entertainment. Every interaction was a power play, a way to remind the Roman aristocracy that their wealth, their status, and even their families were his to command and to mock. As these stories, some possibly exaggerated by later historians, but many rooted in a terrifying reality, began to circulate, the public's perception of their emperor shifted dramatically. The initial hope that had greeted his accession curdled into a pervasive, gnawing fear. The city of Rome, the heart of a mighty empire, became a place of whispers. People learned to guard their words, to control their expressions. A misplaced joke, a look of disapproval, or even appearing too wealthy or popular could be a death sentence. The cruelty was no longer just entertainment. It was a weapon of state, a method of control. Caligula ruled not through respect or loyalty, but through terror. Every citizen, from the lowest plebeian to the most esteemed senator, understood that their lives were subject to the unpredictable and violent whims of one man. The whispers grew from simple gossip into hushed expressions of hatred. Men who were once proud Romans now looked upon their emperor with a mixture of fear and loathing, praying for an end to the madness. This constant state of fear began to erode the very fabric of Roman society. Trust disappeared. People became suspicious of their neighbors, their friends, even their own family members, wondering who might be an informant for the emperor. The public spectacles, once a source of civic pride, became a symbol of their collective subjugation. Caligula's reign of terror demonstrated a terrifying truth, that absolute power, when placed in the hands of a disturbed and cruel individual, doesn't just corrupt, it consumes. It turns a society inward on itself, replacing joy with dread and community with suspicion. The reign of terror, however, could not last forever. The more Caligula pushed, the more he humiliated and terrorized the very people whose job it was to protect him, the more he sowed the seeds of his own destruction. The fear he so carefully cultivated was slowly but surely transforming into a desperate desire for liberation. The whispers of hatred were coalescing into concrete plans. The men he had belittled, the families he had destroyed, and the Praetorian Guard he had insulted were reaching their breaking point. The cruel entertainment was about to come to a dramatic and bloody end, not in the arena, but in the halls of the palace itself. Caligula had made a spectacle of death, and soon he would become the star of his own final gruesome show. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the darker side of Roman history. It's a stark reminder of how fragile civilization can be. If you found this chapter as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. We love having you as part of our history community. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our deep dive into the reign of Caligula. Today, we're re-exploring Chapter 12, his catastrophic relationship with the two pillars of Roman power, the Senate and the army. If you thought his personal life was chaotic, just wait until you see how he handled the state. From the start, Caligula seemed to take a perverse pleasure in tormenting the Senate. Remember the distinguished men who had governed provinces and commanded legions? Caligula treated them like his personal playthings. He would make them run for miles behind his chariot, dressed in their formal togas, or force them to stand and wait on him at dinner, dressed like servants. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a systematic dismantling of their dignity, a public spectacle designed to show everyone that he, and only he, held absolute power. Senators who had once advised emperors were now subjected to the whims of a young man who saw them as nothing more than props in his theater of cruelty. One of the most infamous stories, of course, is about his horse, Incitatus. The historian Suetonius tells us Caligula loved this horse so much that he gave it a marble stable, a jewel-encrusted collar, and even his own house with servants. The ultimate insult to the Senate? Caligula's alleged plan to make Incitatus a consul, the highest office in the Republic. Now, historians debate whether he was serious or if this was just the most elaborate, cynical joke in history. Either way, the message was crystal clear. He valued his horse more than the entire political establishment of Rome, He was telling the most powerful men in the empire that their titles, their history, and their honor meant less to him than his favorite animal. This was psychological warfare, and it left the Senate utterly humiliated and terrified. But his disdain wasn't limited to the politicians in Rome. He soon turned his attention to the army, the very force that had put his family, the Julio-Claudians, in power. In the year 39 AD, Caligula marched north to Gaul, proclaiming a grand military campaign. He was going to follow in the footsteps of his celebrated father, Germanicus, and his great-grandfather, the legendary Julius Caesar. There was just one problem. There wasn't really a war to be fought. The frontiers were relatively stable. So, what did he do? According to our sources, he staged a series of bizarre military theatrics. One account describes a phony surrender. He had the Germanic members of his own bodyguard cross the Rhine, hide in a forest, and then had a message sent to him during dinner that the enemy was at hand. Caligula, playing the part of the heroic commander, rushed out with his friends and a portion of the Praetorian Guard, defeated his own men, and returned to a hero's welcome, awarding himself a triumphal crown for his bravery. The soldiers, who were professional fighting men, must have been completely bewildered by this farce. But the absurdity was just getting started. His grand plan culminated in the invasion of Britain. He marched his legions, tens of thousands of hardened soldiers, to the northern coast of Gaul, facing the English Channel. The troops were arrayed in battle formation, complete with catapults and artillery, all pointed at the sea. The air was thick with anticipation. This was it, the moment they would cross the water and conquer the mysterious island of Britain, a feat even Julius Caesar hadn't fully accomplished. And then Caligula gave his order. It wasn't to board the ships. It wasn't to prepare for an amphibious assault. He commanded his soldiers to collect seashells. Yes, you heard that right. He ordered them to fill their helmets and tunics with shells, which he declared were the spoils of the ocean, treasure plundered from the god Neptune himself. Imagine being a battle-hardened legionary, your life dedicated to discipline and warfare, and your emperor orders you to pick up seashells on the beach as if you were a child. The humiliation is almost impossible to comprehend. This wasn't just an eccentric whim. It was a devastating blow to the morale and honor of the Roman army. These were men who prided themselves on their valor and their conquests. For them, spoils of war were the captured weapons, gold, and slaves of a defeated enemy, not seashells. Caligula had turned a grand military expedition into a national joke. He built a lighthouse to commemorate this victory, a monument to his own delusion. Back in Rome, the Senate was ordered to prepare a full triumph, the greatest honor a general could receive for this non-existent victory. But the damage was done. The commanders and the common soldiers were seething. They had been made fools of, their martial pride trampled for the emperor's amusement. While the senators in Rome could only whisper their dissent in private, the discontent in the army was far more dangerous. Military commanders, men of action and authority, began to see Caligula not just as a tyrant, but as an unstable and incompetent leader who was a liability to the empire. This growing resentment was a ticking time bomb. By alienating both the political elite and the military powerhouse, Caligula had isolated himself completely. He had torn down the very structures that supported his throne, leaving himself exposed and vulnerable. The mockery of the Senate had created enemies in the palace, and the farce on the shores of Gaul had created enemies in the barracks. It was a fatal combination, and the conspiracy that would ultimately end his reign was already beginning to take shape. The men he had humiliated were not the sort to forget. Thank you for joining me for this chapter. The story of Caligula is a stark reminder of how quickly absolute power can corrupt and destroy. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, where we'll witness the final act of this tragedy. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Caesars. Today, we're diving deep into the private world of one of history's most infamous emperors, Caligula. Beyond the public spectacle and political chaos, his family life was a tangled web of intense affection, dark rumors, and ultimately, betrayal. This is the story of Caligula and his family. When Gaius, better known as Caligula, ascended to the throne, Rome rejoiced. He was the son of the beloved Germanicus, a direct link to a golden past. And by his side were his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and his absolute favorite, Drusilla. To understand Caligula, you must first understand his bond with them, especially Drusilla. From the very beginning, their relationship was exceptionally close, even by Roman standards. In public, he showered them with honors that were unprecedented for imperial women. Their names were included in official oaths, they were granted the rights of Vestal virgins, and their images appeared on coins, a privilege usually reserved for the emperor and his male heirs. It was a clear statement. His sisters were not just family. They were an integral part of his regime. But it was Drusilla who held a special place in his heart. Caligula seemed to adore her above all others. He would often leave important state business to dine with her. And when she spoke, he listened with an attentiveness he rarely afforded even his most senior advisors. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe a devotion that was obsessive. He even named her heir to the empire, a move that shocked the Roman elite. In a world dominated by men, naming a woman, and his sister at that, as his successor was revolutionary and deeply unsettling to the Senate. However, this intense affection fueled the rumor mills of Rome. Whispers began to circulate, whispers of a relationship that crossed the sacred lines of sibling piety. The gossip was relentless. It was said that Caligula treated Drusilla not as a sister, but as a wife. These rumors, whether true or simply malicious propaganda spread by his enemies, painted a picture of a depraved and decadent court. The Roman elite, already wary of his autocratic style, saw this as confirmation of his moral corruption. Was it an elaborate smear campaign, or was there truth to the scandalous tales? It's a question historians still debate. The truth is likely lost to time, buried under layers of political intrigue and character assassination. What is certain is that Caligula's behavior defied every Roman norm, and that alone was enough to make him a target. Then, in the year 38 AD, tragedy struck. Drusilla, his beloved sister and named heir, died suddenly from a fever. Caligula's grief was volcanic. He was utterly shattered. He plunged the entire empire into a period of public mourning, something usually reserved for the death of an emperor. Business was suspended, the courts were closed, and any sign of celebration was strictly forbidden, punishable by death. He was inconsolable, wandering his palace at night, crying out her name. But his grief soon morphed into something else, something far more unsettling. He declared Drusilla a goddess, giving her the divine title Diva Drusilla Panthea, the all-goddess. A cult was established in her honor, complete with priests and temples. While deifying deceased members of the imperial family was not entirely new, the scale and intensity of Caligula's devotion to the cult of his dead sister were unprecedented. He was no longer just mourning. He was creating a new religious focus for the empire with his own family at its center. This act further alienated him from the traditionalist Senate, who saw it as yet another sign of his growing megalomania and disregard for Roman tradition. His grief had become a political and religious spectacle, blurring the lines between personal sorrow and imperial power. After Drusilla's death, Caligula's paranoia seemed to spiral out of control. The love he had once showered on his family began to curdle into suspicion and jealousy. He had already forced his other sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, into marriages with men he trusted. But now that trust was eroding. Anyone who had been close to him, anyone who might be seen as a potential rival or a reminder of the family he was losing, became a threat. His gaze fell upon his cousin and brother-in-law, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was not only the husband of the late Drusilla but also a popular and influential figure. Caligula began to see a conspirator in every shadow. Lepidus was accused of plotting against him, supposedly in league with Agrippina and Livilla. The evidence was flimsy at best, likely fabricated, but that didn't matter. Lepidus was swiftly executed without a proper trial. The message was chilling. No one, not even family, was safe from the emperor's wrath. The execution of Lepidus was a turning point. It marked the moment Caligula turned on his own blood. Agrippina and Livilla, his two remaining sisters, were publicly disgraced. He accused them of adultery and treason, parading them in chains and forcing them to carry the funeral urn of Lepidus. He then exiled them to the remote and barren Pontian Islands, the very place their own mother had been exiled years before. The family that had once been the symbol of his power was now shattered, its members either dead, deified, or disgraced. The household that was meant to be his sanctuary had become a nest of perceived vipers. With his sisters gone and his inner circle decimated by executions and fear, Caligula's isolation was complete. The trust that binds a family, and indeed a functioning court, had utterly collapsed. He surrounded himself with sycophants and guards, but he trusted none of them. His palace, once a place of lavish parties, became a fortress of paranoia. He was known to wander its halls late at night, speaking to the moon, tormented by sleeplessness and fear. He saw assassins around every corner, and in a self-fulfilling prophecy, his tyranny bred the very conspiracies he feared. The men who had once been his friends and allies were now terrified of him. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers meant to be his personal protectors, began to see him not as an emperor to be guarded, but as a liability to be removed. His erratic behavior, his cruelty, and his humiliation of the Senate had made him too many enemies. The final betrayal came not from a distant enemy, but from within his own household, from the very men sworn to protect his life. Led by the Praetorian prefect Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had relentlessly mocked, a conspiracy formed. In January of 41 AD, as he walked through a corridor in his palace, Caligula was ambushed and assassinated. The reign that had begun with such hope and familial unity ended in a bloody betrayal, a direct consequence of the fear and paranoia that had consumed him. The story of Caligula and his family is a tragic cautionary tale. It shows how absolute power can corrupt not only an individual's mind but also the most fundamental human bonds. The intense love for his sisters devolved into obsessive control, grief into sacrilegious mania, and suspicion into murderous paranoia. He destroyed the very family that had legitimized his rule, leaving himself isolated and vulnerable. In the end, the emperor who demanded to be treated as a living god died a very human death, abandoned and betrayed by those closest to him. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Caligula's troubled family life. It is a powerful reminder that behind the grand titles and historical accounts lie complex and often tragic human stories. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the annals of history. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the Roman emperors. Today, we delve into the bloody and dramatic final chapter of one of history's most notorious tyrants, the assassination of Caligula. By the year 41 AD, the atmosphere in Rome was not just tense. It was electric with fear. The once beloved young emperor had spiraled into a reign of terror. His paranoia, extravagance, and cruelty had touched every corner of Roman society. Senators who had once advised his great-grandfather, Augustus, now sat in the Curia, wondering if they would survive the day. Wealthy equestrians, the backbone of Roman commerce, were stripped of their fortunes on a whim. Even the members of his own court, the people who saw him daily, walked on eggshells, their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads. But perhaps the most dangerous group to alienate was the very one designed to protect him: the Praetorian Guard. These elite soldiers were the emperor's personal bodyguards, sworn to defend him with their lives. Yet, under Caligula, their loyalty was stretched to its breaking point. They were forced to carry out his brutal orders, witnessing his madness firsthand. The honor of the guard was being tarnished, and their own safety was far from guaranteed. They saw a man who was not just a threat to the Senate or the people, but to the stability of the entire Roman state. The fear was universal. No one was safe from Caligula's unpredictable wrath. In the shadowy corridors of the Palatine Hill and the hushed corners of senatorial villas, whispers of dissent began to coalesce into a concrete plan. This wasn't just idle chatter. It was a conspiracy, a desperate gamble to save Rome from its own leader. At the heart of this plot was a man who knew Caligula better than most, Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard. Chaerea was a seasoned soldier, a veteran who had served under Caligula's heroic father, Germanicus. He was a man of traditional Roman values, hardened by years on the frontier. And he had a very personal reason for his hatred of the emperor. Caligula, in his typical fashion of cruel mockery, constantly taunted Chaerea for his supposedly high-pitched or effeminate voice. He would use insulting, derogatory watchwords and gestures whenever Chaerea was on duty. For a proud Roman officer, this was more than just an insult. It was a daily public humiliation that chipped away at his dignity and authority. But Chaerea's motives went beyond personal grievance. He saw the decay Caligula was inflicting upon the empire. He networked secretly, finding common cause with two other Praetorian tribunes, Cornelius Sabinus and an unnamed officer. They were the muscle, but they needed political backing. Soon, a number of influential senators and equestrians joined the conspiracy. Men like the senator Annius Vinicius saw an opportunity to not just remove a tyrant, but perhaps even restore the old republic, a dream that had never truly died in the hearts of the Roman aristocracy. The plot was a tapestry of motives: personal revenge, political ambition, and a genuine desire to end the tyranny that was suffocating Rome. They knew the risks. Failure meant a swift and excruciating death. But the alternative, allowing Caligula's madness to continue unchecked, seemed even more terrifying. The conspirators were a cross-section of the Roman elite, united by their shared fear and their determination to act. They began to plan, searching for the perfect time and place to strike down the man who believed he was a living god. The conspirators needed the perfect opportunity, a moment when Caligula would be vulnerable, his guard literally down. They found it during the Palatine Games, a series of theatrical performances and athletic contests held in honor of the first emperor, Augustus. It was a multi-day festival, and Caligula, a great lover of the stage, was a constant presence. The conspirators initially planned to strike on the first day of the games, but the logistics were complicated and the crowd was too dense. They wavered, their nerve almost failing them. But Sharia held them together, his resolve hardened by yet another public insult from the emperor. They would wait. Their moment came on January 24th, 41 AD, the final day of the games. The day's events were held in a theater on the Palatine Hill. After the performance around the 7th hour, Caligula decided to leave the main theater to go to his private baths for lunch. He would normally use the main public passage, but on this day, he chose a different route, a secluded, underground corridor known as the Cryptoporticus. This was the moment Sharia had been waiting for. This narrow, enclosed space would limit Caligula's ability to escape and prevent his loyal German bodyguard from intervening effectively. As Caligula walked through the dim passageway, he paused to speak with a group of young actors who were rehearsing. He was relaxed, distracted. Cassius Sharia approached him from behind, under the pretext of asking for the daily password. Caligula, ever the tormentor, gave him another lewd and insulting word. That was the final straw. As Caligula turned away, Sharia drew his sword. "Take this!" He reportedly shouted and struck a heavy blow to the emperor's neck and shoulder. Caligula staggered, wounded but not dead. He tried to run, crying out that he was still alive. But it was too late. The other conspirators, including Cornelius Sabinus, swarmed him. There was no mercy, no hesitation. This was not a clean assassination. It was a frenzied, brutal butchering. They fell upon him, stabbing him again and again. Ancient sources claim he suffered over 30 wounds. The men who had lived in fear for so long unleashed all their pent-up rage and hatred onto the emperor's body. The living god was dead, slain in a dark corridor by his own guards. The assassination plunged the city of Rome into immediate and utter chaos. The sounds of the attack echoed from the Cryptoporticus. Caligula's litter-bearers, hearing the commotion, rushed in with their poles to defend him, but they were no match for the armed Praetorians and were quickly beaten back. His loyal German bodyguard, stationed further away, finally realized what had happened and flew into a blind rage. They stormed through the palace, cutting down anyone they encountered, innocent senators, palace staff, even some of the conspirators who were too slow to escape. Blood flowed through the halls of the Palatine. Meanwhile, news of the emperor's death spread like wildfire through the city. But it was just a rumor at first. Was he truly dead? Was this a trick? The public was confused and terrified. The senators, some of whom were part of the plot, others completely ignorant, fled the theater in panic. They barricaded themselves in their homes, fearing both the wrath of the German guard and the uncertainty of a city without a leader. In the midst of this pandemonium, the body of the emperor was left where it fell in the dark, blood-soaked corridor. His assassins had made no plan for what came next. Their only goal had been to eliminate the tyrant. For a few hours, Caligula's corpse lay abandoned and desecrated. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, his wife Milonia Caesonia and a few loyal friends managed to retrieve his body. They gave it a hasty, partial cremation in a private garden, a pathetic end for a man who had demanded to be worshipped as a god. The power vacuum was total. Rome was leaderless, teetering on the brink of civil war, and the fate of the empire hung in the balance. The question on everyone's mind was, who would rule now? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the fall of Caligula. It is a stark reminder of how power can corrupt and how fear can drive people to extreme acts. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales from the Roman Empire. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the chaotic aftermath and the unlikely rise of the next emperor. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Yet in that short span, he forged a name that would become a byword for tyranny, cruelty, and a terrifying descent into madness. His story is not just one of an emperor. It's a cautionary tale, a dark legend that has captivated and horrified generations. How did a beloved young prince, the son of the revered Germanicus, become one of history's most infamous monsters? And what is the truth behind the shocking tales of his reign? Was he a clinical madman, a victim of a debilitating illness that warped his mind? Or was he a shrewd, if cruel, political operator whose image was deliberately blackened by senators and historians who despised his autocratic style? These questions are at the heart of Caligula's legacy, and they are what we will explore today as we peel back the layers of myth and memory. This tale, whether true or not, perfectly captured the contempt Caligula held for the Roman aristocracy. It was a theatrical, almost surreal gesture of ultimate power and disdain. Then there are the accounts of his sadistic cruelty. Stories of him ordering executions on a whim, of forcing parents to watch their children's demise, and of his infamous declaration, "I wish the Roman people had but a single neck." This statement, more than any other, encapsulates the image of a man detached from humanity, viewing an entire populace as a single entity to be dominated or destroyed. He is said to have wandered the palace halls at night, sleepless and tormented, crying out for the dawn to come. The sources we rely on were written decades after Caligula's death, by men who belonged to the very senatorial class he so aggressively antagonized. Could these shocking stories be exaggerations, political propaganda designed to justify his assassination and ensure his memory was forever stained? Let's consider the context. Caligula inherited a system where the emperor's power was absolute, yet still cloaked in the traditions of the old republic. Perhaps his madness was a radical, brutal attempt to dispense with this facade and establish a clear, Hellenistic-style absolute monarchy, where the ruler was not just the first citizen, but a divine king. His demands for deification, seen as insanity by the traditional Roman elite, were standard practice in the eastern provinces of the empire, like Egypt. Was he trying to unify the diverse religious landscape of his empire under his own divine authority? His conflict with the Senate wasn't just personal pique. It was a fundamental power struggle. By humiliating senators, he was asserting the emperor's total supremacy. His fiscal policies, often described as simple extortion, might have been desperate measures to refill the state treasury, which had been depleted by the lavish spending of his predecessor, Tiberius, and his own grand building projects and public games. For example, Caligula was known for his spectacular games and building projects. He staged elaborate gladiatorial contests and chariot races to win the favor of the masses. He constructed two massive aqueducts for Rome, the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus, which were engineering marvels and vital to the city's well-being. He even built a floating bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples, a 3-mile-long pontoon on which he rode back and forth, clad in the armor of Alexander the Great. His critics called it a pointless, extravagant display of a madman. His supporters might have seen it as a breathtaking demonstration of Roman power and ingenuity, a spectacle to awe both citizens and foreign envoys. This is the great debate of Caligula's legacy. Was he a clinical lunatic, perhaps suffering from epilepsy, hyperthyroidism, or a brain injury from a severe illness early in his reign? Or was he a calculating, albeit ruthless, autocrat whose actions were systematically distorted by his enemies after his death? The truth, as is often the case in history, likely lies somewhere in the murky middle. He was probably a young, inexperienced man, traumatized by the brutal politics that destroyed his family, who was suddenly given limitless power. He was arrogant, thin-skinned, and possessed a cruel, sarcastic wit that he wielded like a weapon against those he saw as his rivals. This combination of personality flaws and absolute authority proved to be a volatile and deadly mixture. He pushed the boundaries of power further than any emperor before him, and in doing so, he made powerful enemies. The Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers meant to protect him, grew tired of his insults and erratic behavior. On January 24, 41 AD, in a dim palace corridor, the conspirators, led by the guard prefect Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had relentlessly mocked, struck him down. His wife and young daughter were murdered shortly after, a brutal and complete erasure of his line. The Senate, overjoyed, immediately moved to condemn his memory, a damnatio memoria, attempting to wipe his name from all public records and monuments. But they failed. You cannot erase a story so dramatic, so terrible. Caligula's name, far from being forgotten, became immortal. He became the archetypal tyrant, a ghost that haunts the corridors of power, a warning of what can happen when one person is given unchecked authority over others. He is the emperor who thought himself a god but was undone by his own very human flaws, his pride, his fear, and his cruelty. His story forces us to confront a timeless and unsettling question about the nature of power. How does it change a person? Can anyone withstand the immense pressure and temptation of absolute control without being corrupted by it? Caligula's reign serves as a stark reminder that power, without restraint, without accountability, without empathy, can be a destructive force not just for the people who suffer under it, but for the one who wields it. It elevates a person to the heavens, only to cast them down into infamy. The memory of Caligula is the memory of Rome at its most terrifying, a dark mirror reflecting the potential for tyranny that lies within the human heart. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legacy of Caligula. It's a complex and disturbing story, but one that holds important lessons for us even today. If you found this exploration of history fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories from the ancient world. Your support means everything and allows us to continue bringing this history to life. We'll see you in the next chapter.